It's Thanksgiving week, so it's time to sit down, carve the turkey, and give thanks for all the best streamers and stashes we've got for week 13 of fantasy football on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome back to the Fantasy First Down. And week 13 means a heap of Thursday games for Thanksgiving. And as you can probably hear from my accent, Thanksgiving's not really a thing I've ever really celebrated. Though, funnily enough, there's only 4 countries in the world that have a public holiday for Thanksgiving. And Australia is one of them. Only it's not all of Australian. It's just an island called Norfolk Island, which has like 2,000 people on it. It's like 2-day boat ride east of where I live. And for some reason, they celebrate American Thanksgiving every year, but on the Wednesday, not really sure why. Nevertheless, we're going to celebrate some streamers and stashes this week because although there's no bye weeks, there's plenty of tough start-sit decisions to be made. So it's important to make sure you're getting your roster as strong as possible, not only for this week, but for that playoff run as well. So let's get right into it. And we'll start off with the quarterbacks as per usual. And CJ Stroud is my favorite for this week. The Jaguars have been the best quarterback matchup all season, and I don't expect that'll change in week 13. The return of Trevor Lawrence should turn this into a shootout, making CJ Stroud a strong streaming option. Meanwhile, Russell Wilson is also a desperation low-end streamer. There's plenty of guys I'd rather start, but it is possible you're struggling at the position. Maybe you've been getting by with guys like, I don't know, Drake May, and you're looking for something a little bit different. Russell Wilson, well, he has only 1 touchdown the last 2 weeks, but you can hardly blame him for struggling in the snow on Thursday Night Football. This week, he faces the 3rd most generous quarterback defense in football in the Bengals. He's got plenty of low-end upside, but admittedly a lower floor than most, so I'd only start him if necessary. Sam Darnold is my favorite stash of the week. He's disappointed in some good matchups at times, but against the difficult Titans and Bears, who are both very good quarterback defenses, in the last fortnight, he somehow has 2 top 10 finishes. He faces the Falcons in week 14 when 6 teams are on bye. So I like him as a stash, and you can stream him next week if you have one of Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, or Drake May as your starter. In fact, realistically, if you've got Drake May as your starter, probably just start Sam Darnold this week instead. Now, running back-wise, and I'll get that ticker out of the way. Chuba Hubbard, my favorite for this week, and I was all about using Chuba Hubbard last week despite the matchup, and as anticipated, the Jonathan Brooks ramp-up got slow as a snail. I would expect a strong Hubbard week against a generous Bucks run defense in week 13, and it's getting to the point where you can nearly think about dropping Jonathan Brooks. You really need a Chuba Hubbard injury. That big contract should be telling you a lot. Brooks doesn't seem ready yet to be taking on a serious load. I think Hubbard is a solid start this week, and if you're lucky, he might even get you by in the playoffs as well. Now, last week I was high on Bucky Irving and Rashad White. Irving was the running back 3 last week, and White scored a touchdown as well. Probably would have had more between the two of them if it wasn't for Sean Tucker randomly taking his first goal line carries of his career and pumping in a touchdown as well. Now, I'm going to back the Buccaneers again after last week's success. This week, this dynamic duo gets a great running back matchup against the Panthers. And you know my rule on the Panthers. Always start them against running backs, kickers, and DSTs. Irving's a must start, and White's a solid PPR flex option because there's no buys. You're probably not needing to be desperate to use White, but there are situations where it's useful to use him. We just got to hope that Tucker stops sniping touchdowns. Now, Jeremy McNichols is an interesting one. Both Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler are at risk of sitting week 13. At the time of recording, it looks like they probably will sit, and I expect one or both to return after their week 14 bye. And this makes Jeremy McNichols very much a one-week streaming option. The Titans aren't the best running matchup, but I'd still use McNichols if you're struggling at the position. I feel like he's probably going to be a top 30 running back. I'd certainly be starting him ahead of guys like Javonte Williams and stuff where you really don't know what workload they're going to get. At least with McNichols, you know he's probably the starter. Now, stashes, I'm massive on running back stashes. They get less important as the season goes on because there's less weeks to have an injury and less benefit out of having those injured players. But Travis Etienne is a guy I love stashing. He had a November from hell, and that continues as he gets the brutal Texans run defense this week. You can't start him this week, but his poor production has led to him being dropped in a lot of leagues. I think that'll be increased next week even. But he's still the lead running back in Jacksonville, and he's got some far easier matchups coming in the fantasy playoffs. So he's a solid pickup in small to medium leagues where he's available. Now, as for the other guys, we're talking handcuffs. I love my running back handcuffs. They've really paid off at times so far this season. We've seen guys like Zach Charbonnet and Ray Davis and people like that have some really big weeks when the starters in front of them have been injured. And it is very possible we'll still see some injuries down the stretch. Tyler Algier is my favorite, but I also really like Braylon Allen. If there's an injury to either of those starters, Bijan or Breece Hall, you're going to see a whole lot of their backup player. And realistically, especially for the Jets, as soon as they're out of playoff contention, it wouldn't surprise me if any sniff of an injury, Breece Hall is shut down and they see what they've got in Allen. Zach Charbonnet is another really good option. You can also go with the Blake Corum if Kyron Williams goes down. Ray Davis is a good option if there's a James Cook injury. Tyjae Spears is fine if you get an injury to Tony Pollard. They're not as high up as those other five. Devin Singletary, I don't mind as a clear backup to Tyrone Tracy. Cam Akers is solid with Aaron Jones, the main guy, but very injury prone. Trey Benson's another guy I've talked about quite a lot. I like him probably even more than Spears, Singletary, and Akers because Connor's so likely to get an injury because of his injury history relative to the other guys. Now, wide receiver wise, and DJ Moore, well, he finally got things started last week. He was actually a surprise starter for me last week, and that panned out pretty well. And this week, with the generous Lions secondary on tap, I'm going back to that well. Moore remains a risky option, but in a top 10 matchup, he's still a solid start for me. Now, the Seahawks in week 12 were Marvin Harrison Jr.'s first top 10 receiving matchup since week 3. And it certainly looked that way. Oh, wait. No, it didn't. He busted royally. But this week he faces the Vikings, and I'm expecting a strong rebound by the Cardinals as a whole. I think he's someone that is going to have another solid week. We've seen him pull it off against some tough defenses. Couldn't do it in a good matchup, but I think most weeks he's going to make that work for him. Kyler's got to be better than he was last week. And finally, Brian Thomas Jr. He's another rookie who's been struggling, but a chest injury's limited him, and he's had Mac Jones without Trevor Lawrence. And look, I say that knowing that Trev hasn't exactly been great himself, but he's significantly better than Mac Jones. So out of his bye week against a generous Texans secondary, I'm expecting a big bounce back by the rookie first rounder. Now, as for wide receiver stashes, guys, you probably shouldn't start this week, but might have some upside moving forward. Well, I like all of the Browns receivers coming off a very tough Steelers matchup. Things get even worse for the Browns receivers who take on the Denver Broncos and their vaunted secondary, and then they get the Steelers again. They're a strong avoid for me this week, especially Cedric Tillman coming off his concussion, but I love their playoff upside, particularly against the Bengals in week 16. So these are guys you should be popping on your bench, knowing that they'll be very useful for you down the track. Meanwhile, Christian Watson has finally become the clear starter in the X-receiver role for Green Bay. And that's meant a big fat donut last week. He scored less than a point. Though it is worth noting that Watson dropped what would have been a guaranteed long touchdown. It just went through his fingers. Now, to be fair, easy to criticize in the rain, very long pass, very hard to catch those, but it is what he's paid for. Romeo Dobbs' injury shores up Watson's role even further, but I can't start him in week 13 against the Dolphins. They're way too good, and especially without Dobbs, probably going to shut Watson down even more. In week 14, when the bye weeks attack, Watson gets the Lions. That's when you want him. So stash him now, regardless of what happens with Dobbs. And next week, I would consider using him instead. You can start him this week if you're desperate, especially if Dobbs is out, but I would prefer not to. Finally, Adam Thielen. I mentioned him last week, and he returned to a moderate snap count as the slot receiver in 3 receiver sets. Jalen Coker's injury certainly helped that, but for Thielen to have value down the stretch, he'll need all of those slot snaps, plus probably some 12 personnel snaps as well. He's going to need to take them away from David Moore or Xavier Liggett. I don't think anyone's touching Liggett snaps, so it's David Moore he needs to take it over from. They did a weird swap, the Panthers, with Liggett and Moore, where Moore moved to that more boundary wide receiver and Liggett moved to that Christian Watson style X receiver that I was talking about earlier with Watson, which generally has a little bit more fantasy value. But last week, oddly, it didn't. It was more that got all the targets. I think most weeks that's actually going to help Liggett. Plus, Coker is suited to playing that Z role as well. So that might mean that he doesn't need to take Thielen snaps. He can take more snaps instead. That might change after Moore was very successful last week, and we don't even know when Coker's going to be back for injury. But there's enough flexibility here that I can see a situation where Thielen bounces back to where he was at times last season. For that reason, in a deeper league, I would consider stashing him, but it wouldn't be out of the question to also stash David Moore. I feel like he's got a little bit of upside as well. Now, tight end wise, and the tight end landscape certainly has improved a lot. All of a sudden, we're talking about guys who are viable options and barely in the top 10. Devonta Smith's absence always opens up opportunities for Dallas Goedert, and that's what I'm banking on this week. While he was quiet against the Rams in Week 12, that was mainly because Saquon Barkley was a ridiculous, massive Saquon Barkley fan. Probably my favorite player and has been for a long time. Against the Ravens, I expect a lot more passing, given they have a strong run defense and a very weak secondary, which admittedly has improved in the last few weeks. So I think a solid Goddard outing is on the cards. Meanwhile, Cade Otton, well, the Panthers have conceded the most points in the league to tight ends, and Cade Otton had one bad week. So just chill, okay? It's not a big problem. Just start Cade Otton as a solid start this week ahead of most of the other tight end streamers. Don't go nuts and start weird plays. Now, you can always start someone like a Taysom Hill. He's higher than both of these guys, but he's not available in enough leagues for me to really consider him. I do think he's someone that you should be thinking about starting, though, if he is available. Otherwise, I think these two guys are very good options who are becoming available in a lot of leagues because Otton got dropped by a heap of people last week. Meanwhile, Noah Gray as a stash. And this has nothing to do with Noah Gray scoring 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. That was just really fluky. This has everything to do with effective handcuffing. Now, to be fair, unfortunately, because of those touchdowns, all of a sudden Gray is going to be a lot harder to get your hands on, but he's still available in most leagues. So if you're struggling at the tight end position or you just own Travis Kelce, Gray is a high-end stash just in case Kelce gets injured approaching the fantasy playoffs. Sadly, Noah Gray doesn't have a famous girlfriend, but I'll leave that for the NFL to worry about. They can handcuff Taylor Swift. Now, I do think that Gray lacks the upside of Kelce, but I still think if Kelce goes down, we will see Gray being ranked as a top 12 option. So if there's no one else around and there's kind of like 18 tight ends rostered in your league and you only have Kelce or someone low down, I would consider Gray because if there's an injury to Kelce, all of a sudden Gray is a true option. Now let's talk kickers and DSTs. With the kickers, Chase McLaughlin is my guy. This is episode 13 of Start Kickers against the Panthers. Just please enjoy. Chase McLaughlin will have a very solid floor because that's what happens every week against the Panthers. This is just a good, solid option. Meanwhile, Matthew Wright is likely to be the kicker for the Chiefs with Spencer Strader injured. Strader had a really strong week 12 as one of my streamers last week. And this week, it's the best kicking matchup in football for the Chiefs. So I'm starting Wright if he's the starter, or I'm starting Strader if Strader's somehow healthy. Because this week against the Raiders, this is just a great matchup for them. And finally, DSTs. Look, the Titans offer the best DST matchup in the league, and this week it's Washington that gets that honor of some free fantasy points. So definitely starting the Commanders and their strong D-line, and also their improving secondary. Meanwhile, the Cowboys DST looked way better last week. They ended up being the DST1, in fact. And Tommy DeVito, well, he didn't look very good last week. So I'm backing Micah Parsons et al. In week 13. And as always, not doing any DST or kicker stashes because it's too early in the season for that. You really only should be stashing those very close to the playoffs or into the playoffs. And that's all we've got for week 13 on the Fantasy First Down Streamers and Stashers show. If you haven't already, it would be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all of your questions over there. Or you can just pop them in the comments below. I just get into them a little bit slower in the comments because I'm not on YouTube as much as I'm on Instagram. You can also message us on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, although again, Instagram's the quickest way to get messages back and forth. And finally, you can check out my rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Also got a couple of articles out over at football.rasball.com. I look forward to catching up with you guys in a couple of days' time when we have our Week 13 Start Sit show. I will talk to you guys then.